to the Country Watch Political Intelligence Briefing Quick Hits, a weekly briefing of hot stories across the world in brief. I'm Denise Youngblood Coleman, the Editor-in-Chief and Senior International Affairs Analyst at Country Watch. This week, the featured country is the Solomon Islands, where violence, turmoil, and destructive rioting were rocking the Pacific Island nation in late November 2021. Officials in the Solomon Islands implemented an overnight citywide curfew in Honduras in an effort to curb the spread of violence and destruction, but much of the damage was already done, with debris littering the streets, businesses looted, ATMs smashed, and buildings entirely burned down, including factories, banks, and a police station. Most of the destruction, though, was in the Chinatown district of Honduras, where arson attacks left a smoldering landscape in the wake of the destruction. Significantly, one of the few buildings left standing in Honduras' Chinatown was a building displaying Taiwanese flags. At the heart of the unrest have been geopolitical considerations in the strategic Pacific region. Specifically, the decision by the government of the Solomon Islands to switch its allegiance in 2019 from Taiwan to mainland China, as Beijing seeks to expand its influence in the region, has been a contentious issue for some time. It has divided communities across the islands that make up the archipelago. Tensions had intensified between the residents of the island of Guadalcanal, where the capital of Honduras was located, and the residents of the island of Malaita. While Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare was responsible for the shifts in foreign policy, Daniel Suidani, the Premier of Malaita, opposed the move. Premier Suidani vociferously vowed not to engage with Beijing and went so far as to terminate licenses of businesses owned by ethnic Chinese. That move evoked condemnation from the national government. The difference in foreign policy orientation moved into scandal territory when Premier Suidani said he had been offered a bribe to change his position. For his part, Sogavare dismissed the claim. Regardless of the veracity of the accusation or the denial, the reality was that there was a grave consternation brewing over the geopolitical shift from Taipei to Beijing, which were fueling socio-political tensions, intensifying them to the proverbial boiling point, and ultimately leading to this eruption of violence in the latter part of 2021, with ethnic Chinese being particularly targeted. Also in the crosshairs of the popular outbreak of anger has been Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare himself, with angry protesters gathering outside his home and police in riot gear attempting to disperse the crowd. Protesters had also attempted to storm the parliament to register their discontent. They have been demanding that the embattled prime minister step down from office. Other demands from protesters have been that the ties with China be limited and that the rights of self-determination for the people of Malaita be respected. Faced with an untenable situation, Prime Minister Sogavare requested assistance from neighboring countries. In response, Australia, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and most recently New Zealand dispatched scores of security personnel to the archipelago to try to recapture some stability. Meanwhile, the Red Cross warned of food shortages in the capital city. Prime Minister Sogavare placed the blame on the turmoil on his political opposition. He also intimated that Taiwan and the United States might be to blame because of their opposition to Beijing's influence. Matthew Wally, the leader of the opposition, denied organizing the unrest and also dismissed the notion that the outbreak of violence could be placed at the door of foreign powers. Nevertheless, with businesses in Honduras' Chinatown district being particularly targeted, with ethnic Chinese seeing the brunt of the destruction, the foreign interference aspect of the chaos unfolding in the Solomon Islands could hardly be ignored. Indeed, the Chinese government in Beijing made clear that it was seriously concerned about attacks on Chinese citizens and institutions. As I move on to some of the other countries I've covered this week, I'd like to stay with the theme of China's influence across the world. For example, as China looks to expand its global influence, it has targeted Djibouti as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Of significance has been the infrastructure investments China has made in the East African nation state, which is largely devoid of natural resources, but nonetheless relatively stable politically and strategically located at the entrance of the Red Sea. Since the early 2000s, Chinese investments in Djibouti have included school construction, road renovation, office infrastructure, and even the building of a new foreign ministry building. Chinese investment increased in 2012 under President Xi Jinping and the inauguration of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. The idea among Djiboutian elites is to use Chinese finance and technology to make the country the Singapore of the African continent. Also notable, though, is the establishment of a Chinese military base in Djibouti, which opened in 2017. There are other military bases in Djibouti, French and American, for example, but the opening of a Chinese military installation in Djibouti clearly exemplifies Beijing's intent to secure its foothold in Africa. The problem for Djibouti, though, is that in accepting this level of capital investment in Djibouti, President Ismail Omar Guelleh has made his country economically dependent on China, possibly risking the country's autonomy. In fact, China holds more than 70% of Djibouti's debt. What happens if Djibouti is unable to repay its loans to China? One possibility is that it could be forced to cede control of strategic interests like the new port, as was the case in Sri Lanka when it could not repay its loans to China. Across the world in Barbados, at midnight on November 30th, 2021, Prince Charles, the heir apparent to Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom, arrived in Barbados to preside over the ceremony that would see the Caribbean island nation transition to republic status. While this story would seem on the face of it, the story of Barbados shedding some of its colonial past and embracing a post-colonial future, once again, China factors into the mix. At issue? The argument from some British lawmakers that the removal of Queen Elizabeth II as the head of state in Barbados has been fueled by China's growing influence in the region, as Beijing has invested close to $450 million into the island's tourism industry in recent years. Given these examples of China's influence in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, I'd like to touch on United States President Joe Biden's remarks regarding Taiwan. At least on 3 occasions in recent months, President Biden has ignited speculation about his country's stance on Taiwan. The latest incident occurred after a virtual summit with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, when President Biden said in his remarks to reporters that Taiwan, and I quote, makes its own decisions and cast in Taiwan as independent. Significantly, these remarks were made after Biden had assured Xi of the United States' prevailing support for the One China policy. Hours after Biden's intimation of Taiwanese independence, with alarm bells going off in Beijing, President Biden had to issue a clarification in which he noted that the long-standing policy towards Taiwan remained in place. In later remarks to reporters, President Biden said, and I quote, "We're not going to change our policy at all. We're encouraging them to do exactly what the Taiwan Act requires." He added, "That's what we're doing. Let them make up their minds. Let them make up their own minds, period. Taiwan." It should be noted that President Biden's remarks on Taiwan could not be easily dismissed as a faux pas or a gaffe. As a veteran statesman and a former member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Biden himself voted in 1979 to approve the Taiwan Relations Act. Thus, it is more likely that Biden's remarks were intentional and aimed at delivering a tacit message to Beijing that has been taking a more aggressive posture as regards Taiwan. Finally, elections were held in Honduras. The governing National Party was being represented by Nasri Asfoura as the polls closed and would be challenged Finally, elections were held in Honduras. The governing National Party was being represented by Nasri Asfoura at the polls and would be challenged by the leftist opposition candidate Xiomara Castro of Libre Party. Castro was the wife of former leftist President Manuel Zelaya, who was ousted from office in 2009 in a coup d'etat. On election day, Hondurans went to the polls to cast their ballots. Once these votes were counted, it was apparent that Castro was on the verge of capturing a landslide victory. This result would bring a decisive end to the domination of the right-wing National Party in Honduras. It would also mean that Castro was set to become Honduras's first female president. Her victory at the helm of Libra would also serve as a vindication for the democratic socialist wing of the country and for her husband, former President Zelaya. In the next weeks, I'll be covering the status of Iran's JCPOA nuclear negotiations taking place in Austria. I'll also cover the buildup of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine. In addition, I'll be looking at the second round of the Chilean election and government formation in Germany. Also in my agenda, the landscape in the Horn of Africa, specifically with regard to Sudan after the coup d'etat and the ongoing state of emergency in Ethiopia. I'd also like to take this time to mention my comprehensive Afghanistan withdrawal report called Sunsets in the Graveyard of Empires, which will soon be available for purchase from the CountryWatch website at www.countrywatch.com. Thank you for your time. Have a great day, and remember, now more than ever, we live in an interconnected world.